James came home earlier than usual that evening, the sharp scent of freshly cut lumber still clinging to his clothes. The house was quiet, too quiet for a home with a 10-year-old. Setting his toolbox down, he heard faint laughter coming from the back room. It was Evelyn's voice, soft and light, the kind of laugh he hadn't heard directed at him in years. Curious, he walked toward the sound, his boots thudding softly against the floorboards. As he approached the slightly ajar door, the laughter stopped, replaced by a hushed murmur. He froze, his heart quickening. Evelyn's tone was lower now, deliberate, almost secretive. "I can't wait either, soon," she said, her words barely audible. James felt a pang in his chest, an unfamiliar unease he couldn't quite place. He knocked gently on the door, pushing it open. Evelyn looked up from her phone, startled. Her expression shifted almost instantly to a practiced smile. "You're home early," she said, her voice casual, though her hands fumbled to lock the phone screen. "Yeah," James replied, studying her. "Got the job done quicker than I thought. Where's Lily?" "She's at Beth's house for a playdate. I figured I'd get some quiet time." She gestured to the mug of tea beside her, her fingers curling around it tightly. James nodded, his gaze lingering a moment longer before he turned away. Something about her tone, the way she clutched the mug, felt off. It wasn't the first time he'd noticed her acting this way lately. Shorter responses, distracted glances, and an almost palpable distance between them. That night, as Evelyn slept beside him, her back turned, James stared at the ceiling. The faint glow of her phone screen had been the last thing he saw before she placed it on the nightstand and rolled over. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in their marriage. Memories of the early days flooded his mind, her laughter, her warmth, the way she used to reach for his hand in the middle of a conversation. Now there was a chasm between them, growing wider every day. The next morning, James made himself coffee, his hands steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Evelyn came down the stairs, her hair slightly mussed, a half smile on her lips. "You're up early," she said, grabbing a yogurt from the fridge. "Got a lot on my mind," James replied, sipping from his mug. He decided to test the waters. "Heard you laughing last night. What was so funny?" Evelyn froze for a fraction of a second, so brief James almost missed it. "Oh, just a silly meme Beth sent me," she said quickly, turning her back to him to grab a spoon. "We were texting about the book club meeting next week." "Beth must be pretty funny then," James said, his voice neutral. Evelyn chuckled nervously but didn't respond. The day passed uneventfully, but James couldn't shake the gnawing doubt. That evening, while Evelyn was showering, a notification lit up her phone on the kitchen counter. He didn't mean to look, but the screen was right there. The message preview read, "I miss your laugh. Can't wait to see you again." James felt the air leave his lungs as if he'd been punched. His hand hovered over the phone for a moment before he pulled away, his heart pounding in his ears. He heard the water shut off upstairs and quickly moved to the living room, his mind racing. That night, James lay awake, listening to Evelyn's steady breathing beside him. He had always believed their life together was solid, unshakable. But now, cracks were forming, and James didn't know how to stop them from widening. For days, James observed Evelyn with quiet intensity. He noticed the way she clutched her phone during dinner, how she excused herself to take calls in another room, and how her once familiar laughter had become an occasional secretive sound that never seemed to include him. One evening, Evelyn left her phone on the couch while she ran upstairs to grab something. James hesitated for only a moment before picking it up. The screen was locked, but a text notification glowed brightly. "Soon, I can't wait." James set the phone down just as Evelyn came back, her eyes darting to the device. She picked it up quickly, clutching it as though it held her deepest secrets. "I forgot I needed to respond to a work thing," she said, forcing a smile. James nodded, his face unreadable. Inside, though, something shifted. He didn't know what was going on, but he would find out. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just in his head. James sat in the living room that night, his hands gripping the armrests of the worn recliner, his mind spinning. The message he'd seen on Evelyn's phone earlier replayed in his head like a broken record. "I miss your laugh. Can't wait to see you again." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of betrayal, crushing his chest with each memory of Evelyn's distant smiles and evasive glances. He stared at the clock, its soft ticking the only sound in the room. Midnight. Evelyn had gone to bed an hour ago, but James stayed rooted to his chair, unsure of what to do next. Was he overreacting? Could it all be some misunderstanding? He wanted to believe it was, but the growing ache in his gut told him otherwise. Finally, he stood, the resolve in his chest overtaking his doubts. Moving silently up the stairs, he eased open the door to their bedroom. Evelyn was sound asleep, her face relaxed, almost peaceful. Her phone sat on the nightstand, the faint glow of the charging light taunting him. His hands shook as he reached for it, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might wake her. Unlocking the phone was surprisingly easy. Her passcode hadn't changed. For a moment he hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen. What if I'm wrong? But then the memory of that message pushed him forward. What he saw next made his blood run cold. The messages were unmistakable. Rick, a name he didn't recognize, was far from a casual acquaintance. The texts between Evelyn and Rick were intimate, riddled with inside jokes, pet names, and plans for the future. James scrolled back through weeks of conversations, his disbelief deepening with each new revelation. "I'm counting down the days until we're together," Rick had written a week ago. "Me too," Evelyn replied. "I've been so careful with everything. He has no idea." James felt the walls close in around him. Evelyn wasn't just having an emotional affair. She was orchestrating a complete betrayal. And then came the worst blow. "Make sure to empty the account before you leave," Rick's message read. "We'll need every penny to start fresh." James froze, the words blurring in front of his eyes. Empty the account? Panic surged through him as he realized the implications. He opened their banking app and checked their savings account. The balance was much lower than he remembered. Scrolling through the recent transactions, he saw multiple withdrawals, thousands of dollars at a time. A sickening realization settled over him. Evelyn wasn't just planning to leave. She was taking everything with her. He sat on the edge of the bed, the phone still clutched in his trembling hand. His chest felt hollow, as though the air had been sucked out of the room. How long had this been going on? How had he missed it? As the first rays of dawn filtered through the blinds, James finally put the phone back on the nightstand, careful not to wake Evelyn. He made his way downstairs, his mind racing. He needed to act, but how? Confronting her now wouldn't solve anything. He needed proof. More than just messages and his own suspicions. Sipping his coffee, James stared out the kitchen window, his mind drifting back to Lily. What would this mean for her? The thought of their daughter being caught in the middle of this betrayal was unbearable. For her sake, he needed to stay calm and think strategically. Later that morning, Evelyn appeared in the kitchen, her hair still damp from the shower. "You're up early again," she said with a yawn, pouring herself a cup of coffee. James forced a smile, masking the storm brewing inside him. "Couldn't sleep," he said, keeping his tone light. Evelyn looked at him for a moment, her expression unreadable, before turning her attention to her phone. She tapped at the screen, her face softening as she read something. James felt his stomach churn. "Anything interesting?" he asked casually. Evelyn blinked, startled. "What?" "Your phone," he said, gesturing to it. "You've been glued to it lately." Her lips curved into a faint smile, but there was tension in her eyes. "Just book club stuff," she said quickly, turning the phone face down on the counter. "You know how chatty Beth can be." James nodded, pretending to accept her explanation. Inside, though, the fire burned hotter. He didn't know who this Rick was, but he was about to find out. Later that day, James sat in his truck outside a hardware store, his phone in hand. He'd never considered hiring a private investigator before, but now it seemed like the only logical step. He needed someone who could uncover the truth without alerting Evelyn. He dialed the number of a local investigator, Mark Nelson, whose name he'd found online. After a brief conversation, Mark assured him they would begin digging immediately. James ended the call and leaned back in his seat, staring at the dashboard. His world was crumbling around him, and he was powerless to stop it. But he wasn't going to let Evelyn take everything from him, not without a fight. James sat in his truck in the grocery store parking lot, the engine humming softly as he stared at his phone. The contact for Mark Nelson, a private investigator recommended by a friend, was already saved. For a long moment his thumb hovered over the call button. He didn't want this to be real, didn't want to believe Evelyn, his Evelyn, was capable of such betrayal. But the messages, the withdrawals, the lies, they didn't leave much room for doubt. He took a deep breath and hit the call button. "Mark Nelson Investigations," a crisp voice answered on the third ring. "Yes," James said, his throat dry. "I need some help. It's personal." Mark listened patiently as James described the situation, his voice halting as he explained about the texts, the hidden account, and the man named Rick. Mark didn't press for details, but reassured James that they'd start immediately. "We'll find out who this guy really is," Mark promised. For the first time in days, James felt a flicker of control. He ended the call, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He wasn't sure what Mark would uncover, but he was prepared for the worst. That evening, James returned home, determined to keep his suspicions hidden. Evelyn greeted him with a faint smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Dinner's almost ready," she said, stirring a pot on the stove. "Smells good," James replied, keeping his tone light. He walked over to the table and noticed her phone lying face down next to a stack of mail. The urge to pick it up gnawed at him, but he forced himself to walk away. He couldn't risk tipping her off. Not yet. At dinner, Lily chattered about her day at school, her innocence a stark contrast to the turmoil James felt inside. Evelyn was quieter than usual, her gaze flicking to her phone every few minutes. When it buzzed, she jumped slightly and quickly silenced it, offering a tight smile. "Work," she said, not meeting James's eyes. James nodded, his expression unreadable. He was getting better at hiding the storm brewing beneath the surface. The next day, Mark called with an update. "Your wife's friend Rick isn't who he claims to be," he began. "His real name is Richard Grayson. He's got a long history of fraud and larceny, targets married women, gets them to siphon money from their families, and then disappears with it." James gripped the phone tightly, anger bubbling to the surface. "And Evelyn? She's likely another victim," Mark said carefully. "But from what I've seen so far, she's fully participating in the withdrawals and transfers. This doesn't look like coercion. She knows what she's doing." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He thanked Mark and ended the call, sitting in stunned silence. Evelyn wasn't just being deceived. She was complicit. That evening, James began watching her more closely. He noticed how she lingered on her phone late at night, her face lit by the glow of the screen. How she excused herself to take calls outside, claiming it was too loud in the house. Even her laughter, once so familiar, now sounded forced. It was as though the woman he'd known for over a decade was slipping away, replaced by someone he barely recognized. One night he found himself standing outside their bedroom door, listening. Inside, Evelyn was on the phone, her voice hushed but animated. "Yes, everything's ready." "No, he doesn't suspect anything," she said, followed by a soft laugh. James clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He wanted to burst in, demand answers, but he stopped himself. He couldn't risk it. Not yet. The next morning, James received another update from Mark. "She's been meeting Rick regularly," Mark said. "They have a routine, coffee shops, motels, even parks. They're careful, but not careful enough." James's stomach churned. He thought of Evelyn packing Lily's lunch that morning, smiling as if everything was normal. The betrayal cut deeper with each passing day, but he couldn't let her see his pain. He needed to stay one step ahead. That evening, James forced himself to act as though nothing was wrong. Evelyn chatted about the upcoming book club retreat, her excitement barely masked. James nodded along, his face calm, but inside he was raging. The retreat wasn't real, he knew it. And soon she would too. Friday evening arrived, the sun dipping below the horizon as James pulled into the driveway. His truck idled for a moment as he sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel. Inside the house, he knew Evelyn would be moving through her well-rehearsed routine, packing her bag for the so-called book club retreat. The lie hung in the air between them, unspoken but palpable. Tonight, everything would change. He killed the engine and stepped out. the weight of what he was about to do settling heavily on his shoulders. As he entered the house, the aroma of dinner greeted him, chicken roasting in the oven. Evelyn, always meticulous, was nothing if not consistent in keeping up appearances. "You're home a little later than usual," Evelyn said casually, glancing over her shoulder from the stove. She looked calm, too calm. Her bag sat neatly by the door, the sight of it tightening the knot in James's stomach. "Had to finish a few things," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. He moved closer to her, watching as she stirred a pot of gravy, her movements precise and practiced. She turned to face him, her smile a thin mask. "I figured we could eat before I head out," she said, her tone light, almost cheerful. "Beth and the girls are meeting early tomorrow morning, so I wanted to get a head start." James forced a nod, his eyes flicking to the bag again. He could picture its contents without opening it: clothes, jewelry, and cash. It was all there, neatly tucked away for her escape. He'd seen the bank withdrawals, each one more damning than the last. She thought she was careful, but her carelessness was written in the small details. They sat at the dinner table, Lily between them, her innocent chatter filling the silence James couldn't bring himself to break. Evelyn played her role perfectly, laughing at all the right moments, her voice warm and reassuring. But James couldn't focus on her words. His thoughts were consumed by what he'd learned from Mark, the meetings with Rick, the money siphoned from their accounts, and the cabin where she planned to rendezvous with her lover. As they cleared the table, James couldn't help but notice Evelyn's impatience. She moved with a purpose, her eyes darting to the clock every few minutes. When Lily asked if she could stay up a little later, Evelyn's response was unusually sharp. "Not tonight, sweetheart. Mom has to leave soon." James's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he knelt beside Lily, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You can hang out with me, kiddo," he said softly. Lily beamed, her trust in him unshakable. When Evelyn went upstairs to grab something, James took the opportunity to inspect her bag. He unzipped it carefully, his hands trembling. As expected, it contained a mix of essentials and valuables, her jewelry box, cash envelopes, and a few family heirlooms he'd assumed were safely stored. A flash of anger surged through him, but he quickly zipped the bag shut before she returned. Minutes later, Evelyn came back down, the heels of her boots clicking against the hardwood floor. "I'll call when I get there," she said, grabbing the bag and slinging it over her shoulder. James watched her, his expression carefully neutral. "Drive safe," he said, forcing the words out. Evelyn hesitated, her eyes searching his face as if looking for a sign that he suspected anything. But James gave her nothing. She smiled faintly and leaned down to kiss Lily on the forehead. "Be good for Dad, okay?" Lily nodded, her small hand waving as Evelyn walked out the door. James waited until he heard her car pull out of the driveway before he moved. He called Mark immediately. "She's on her way," James said, his voice tight. "You said the cabin's about an hour from here?" "Roughly," Mark replied. "If she's meeting him tonight, this is your chance to see it for yourself. I'll text you the coordinates." James ended the call and grabbed his keys, his heart pounding as he started the truck. The bag, the lies, the secrecy, it all felt like a betrayal too deep to recover from. But he needed to see it through. He needed to know the full truth, no matter how much it hurt. The drive to the cabin was quiet, the road winding through dense woods. When James arrived, he parked a safe distance away and stepped out, the crisp night air biting at his skin. Ahead, a dim light glowed from inside the cabin. His stomach churned as he approached, each step heavier than the last. Through the window he saw them. Evelyn was standing near the fireplace, her body language animated as she spoke to Rick. He was taller than James had imagined, his posture confident and relaxed. Evelyn handed him an envelope, money no doubt. Rick took it, his smile smug, his demeanor that of a man who knew he was in control. James felt his hands clench into fists. He wanted to burst through the door, demand answers, but he forced himself to hold back. This wasn't the time for confrontation. Not yet. James tightened his grip on the truck's steering wheel, parked just far enough from the cabin to avoid detection. The forest around him was dark, and the silence only amplified the roar of his thoughts. From where he sat, he could see the faint glow of the cabin's windows. Evelyn's silhouette moved inside, and next to her, a man, Rick. His pulse hammered in his ears as he stepped out of the truck, closing the door gently to avoid making noise. Each step toward the cabin felt heavier than the last, his emotions warring between heartbreak and anger. He wasn't here to fight. Not yet. He was here to see the truth for himself. Approaching the window, James crouched low to stay out of sight. The voices from inside carried through the thin walls, and every word sliced through him like a blade. "I'm telling you, he doesn't suspect a thing," Evelyn said, her tone confident but tinged with a nervous edge. She sat on the edge of a worn couch, her body leaning slightly toward Rick. Rick chuckled, his voice deep and smooth, oozing arrogance. "Good. You've done well, babe. Once we're out of here, you'll forget all about that boring life. Just think about it. No more small-town nonsense. No more James." James's breath caught in his throat. The casual dismissal of his name felt like a physical blow. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay silent. "Did you bring the rest of the cash?" Rick asked. Evelyn reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, handing it to him. "It's everything I could pull without him noticing," she said, her voice quieter now. Rick opened the envelope and flipped through the bills, nodding in approval. But then, his expression darkened. "This isn't as much as we talked about." Evelyn hesitated, her voice faltering. "I couldn't take more without raising suspicion. James isn't stupid." Rick stood abruptly, his towering figure looming over her. "We had a deal, Evelyn. I'm not risking my neck for scraps. If this is all you've got, maybe I should reconsider." Evelyn's eyes widened, fear flashing across her face. "Rick, please, don't do this. I gave you everything I could." James had heard enough. His hands trembled as he stepped back from the window, rage boiling over. He didn't care anymore about planning or timing. Evelyn's fear-filled voice, directed at someone else, felt like the final betrayal. He stormed toward the front door and kicked it open with a force that echoed through the small cabin. Rick turned sharply, his face hardening as James stepped inside. Evelyn froze, her mouth open in shock. "James!" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't!" James said, his tone low but cutting. His eyes locked onto Rick. "You must be Rick. I've heard so much about you." Rick smirked, crossing his arms. "Well, well. The husband. I was wondering when you'd show up." "Is that so?" James shot back, his voice steady but dangerous. "Then I guess you know how this ends." Rick stepped forward, his smirk fading into a sneer. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with, pal. Why don't you walk away before you embarrass yourself?" "Embarrass myself?" James barked out a humorless laugh. "That's rich coming from a con artist hiding in a cabin. But go ahead, try me." Evelyn stood between them, her voice cracking as she pleaded, "Stop it, both of you. This isn't what I wanted." James turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Isn't it? You lied to me. You stole from me. You chose him. I made a mistake," Evelyn cried. "I wasn't thinking straight." "No," James interrupted, his voice sharp. "You were thinking about yourself, and now you can live with the consequences." Before Evelyn could respond, Rick lunged forward, his fist aimed at James. But James was ready. He sidestepped quickly, grabbing Rick's arm and slamming it against the edge of the table. Rick cursed, swinging again, but James ducked and shoved him backward. Rick stumbled, hitting the wall with a thud. Just as he regained his balance, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the tension. Rick's expression twisted in panic. "You called the cops!" Rick spat, glaring at James. "What did you expect?" James replied coldly. The front door burst open as two officers stormed in, guns drawn. Rick tried to run, but they tackled him to the ground, cuffing his hands behind his back. Evelyn sank onto the couch, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. As the officers hauled Rick to his feet, he turned to Evelyn, his voice venomous. "You think he's going to forgive you? You're nothing to him now. You're nothing to anyone." Evelyn flinched, tears spilling down her cheeks. James said nothing, his gaze fixed on her as the officers led Rick out of the cabin. When they were gone, the silence between James and Evelyn was deafening. She finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "James, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far." James stared at her, his face hard, his heart heavy. "You didn't mean for me to find out," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "That's the only thing you're sorry for." Evelyn sobbed, burying her face in her hands. But James didn't move to comfort her. Instead, he turned and walked out of the cabin, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on him like never before. The courtroom was stifling, the air thick with tension. James sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His attorney whispered updates in his ear, but James barely heard them. His focus was locked on Evelyn, who sat across the room, her head bowed and shoulders slumped as though the weight of her choices had finally settled on her. The trial had moved faster than James anticipated. The evidence was damning. The bank records, the testimonies from law enforcement, and the stolen items recovered from the cabin. Evelyn's involvement was undeniable, but what hurt the most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was her refusal to own it. Even now she avoided his gaze, her hands fidgeting nervously with the hem of her blouse. "Your Honor," James's attorney said, standing to address the judge, "the defendant's actions were not only deceitful but calculated. She conspired with Richard Grayson, a known felon, to defraud her husband and jeopardize the financial stability of their family. This is not a case of a momentary lapse in judgment. This is premeditated theft and betrayal." The judge nodded, his expression stern. "Does the defendant's counsel have anything to add?" Evelyn's attorney rose, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, my client acknowledges her mistakes and expresses deep regret for her actions. She was manipulated by Mr. Grayson, who preyed on her vulnerabilities and exploited her trust." James shook his head slightly, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Manipulated? Vulnerable? Those words felt hollow in the face of the truth. Evelyn had made her choices. She'd stolen from him, lied to him, and broken their family, not because she was weak, but because she was selfish. "Mr. Davis," the judge said, addressing James directly, "would you like to make a statement?" James stood slowly, feeling the weight of the room's attention shift toward him. His throat tightened, but he forced himself to speak. "Your Honor, I trusted my wife. I built my life around her, and I believed in the family we created together. What she did wasn't just a betrayal, it was a deliberate act to tear that life apart. She didn't just take money, she took my faith, my stability, everything I worked for." He paused, glancing briefly at Evelyn. "I'm not here to punish her. That's not my job, but I need the court to understand the impact of her actions, not just on me, but on our daughter. Lily deserves better than this chaos. She deserves stability. And that's what I'm fighting for." James sat down, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them together. He felt the weight of his words hanging in the air, the raw truth of his pain exposed for everyone to see. The judge called a recess, and James stepped out into the hallway to catch his breath. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes as the sound of footsteps echoed around him. Moments later, he heard Evelyn's voice. "James!" He opened his eyes, finding her standing a few feet away. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed red as though she'd been crying. "What do you want, Evelyn?" he asked, his tone flat. I wanted to say I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean for it to get this far. I never wanted to hurt you." James let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You didn't mean for it to get this far. You didn't want to hurt me. Evelyn, every step you took, every lie, every dollar you stole was a choice. You knew exactly what you were doing." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she reached out toward him. "Please, James, I made a mistake, Rick. He manipulated me. I wasn't thinking straight." James took a step back, his voice cold. "You weren't thinking about me, or Lily. You were thinking about yourself, and now you're facing the consequences." Evelyn's sobs grew louder, drawing the attention of a nearby officer who moved closer, ready to intervene if needed. James turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the hallway, her cries echoing after him. When court resumed, the judge delivered his verdict. Evelyn was sentenced to 2 years of probation in order to complete 200 hours of community service. She was also required to pay restitution for the money she stole. It wasn't the harshest punishment, but it was enough to send a clear message. Afterward, James stood outside the courthouse, the autumn wind biting against his skin. He felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that it was over, but sadness for what had been lost. "Mr. Davis," his attorney said, approaching him, You'll be receiving full custody of Lily. The court has granted your request." James nodded, his chest tightening at the thought of his daughter. "Thank you," he said quietly. As he walked to his truck, James glanced back at the courthouse one last time. Evelyn stood at the top of the steps, her figure small and hunched against the wind. He felt no anger toward her anymore, only pity. She had made her choices, and now she would have to live with them. The house felt emptier than ever. James stood in the kitchen, staring at the breakfast table where Lily sat quietly, poking at her scrambled eggs with her fork. Her small shoulders slumped, her usually bright eyes dull and unfocused. The air was heavy, filled with a silence that neither of them seemed able to break. "Lily," James said softly, his voice careful, almost hesitant. "You okay, kiddo?" She shrugged, not looking up. "Mom's not coming back, is she?" The question struck him harder than he expected. For a moment, James couldn't find the words. He knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "No," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "She's not. But I promise you this. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." Lily nodded, but her small frame seemed to curl inward, retreating into itself. James's chest tightened as he watched her. It wasn't fair. She didn't deserve this. The next few days were a blur of adjustments. James threw himself into his work at the carpentry shop during the day and devoted his evenings to Lily. But the cracks in their routine were impossible to ignore. Lily grew quieter, more withdrawn, and James found himself struggling to fill the void that Evelyn had left behind. One evening, as James tucked Lily into bed, she turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think Mom misses me?" James froze, his hand hovering over her blanket. He took a deep breath, willing his voice to remain steady. "I think she does, Lily, in her own way." Lily's eyes filled with tears, and James felt his heart break all over again. "But why didn't she stay? Did I do something wrong?" James pulled her close, holding her tightly as her small body shook with sobs. "Oh, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "None of this is your fault. Your mom made her own choices, but that doesn't change how much I love you. You're the most important thing in my life, Lily. Never forget that." As Lily cried into his shoulder, James felt a new resolve harden within him. He couldn't change the past, but he could give his daughter a future filled with love, stability, and hope. She deserved nothing less. The next morning, James woke early and made a list of everything he needed to do. First on the list was reconnecting with Lily in a way that reminded her she was safe and loved. He packed a picnic lunch and surprised her with a trip to the park, a place they hadn't visited in months. At first, Lily was hesitant. Her responses to his questions clipped and guarded. But as the day went on, she began to relax. James chased her around the playground, pretending to be a monster while she shrieked with laughter. They ate peanut butter and jelly sandwiches on a worn picnic blanket, and for the first time in weeks, James saw her smile, a real smile. "Daddy," she said suddenly, looking up at him with wide eyes, "do you think we can be happy again?" James swallowed the lump in his throat and smiled down at her. "I know we can, Lily. We just have to take it one day at a time." That evening, as they sat together on the couch watching a cartoon, James felt a glimmer of hope. Lily leaned against him, her head resting on his arm, and for a moment the weight of their reality seemed lighter, but the peace was fragile, easily shattered. The next day, James received a letter from Evelyn. Her handwriting was familiar, but the sight of her name on the envelope filled him with unease. He stared at it for a long time before finally opening it. The letter was filled with apologies, hollow words that did little to ease his pain. She wrote about her regret, her mistakes, and how she hoped to rebuild a relationship with Lily someday. But it was the final line that made his blood boil. "I hope, in time, you'll find it in your heart to forgive me." James crumpled the letter in his fist, the words echoing in his mind. Forgive her? After everything she'd done? He tossed the letter into the trash, his jaw clenched. Forgiveness was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not now, not when he was still picking up the pieces of the life she had destroyed. Later that night, as James sat alone in the living room, he thought about Lily's question. "Do you think we can be happy again?" He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. He would do whatever it took to protect his daughter, to give her a life free from the pain and chaos that Evelyn had brought into their world. He glanced at the calendar on the wall, each square a reminder of the days he had survived. Tomorrow would be another step forward, and as he turned out the lights and headed to bed, he whispered a silent promise to himself, "We will be happy again, no matter what." The courtroom was quieter than James expected. The steady shuffle of papers, the occasional cough, and the soft hum of the overhead lights created an almost surreal atmosphere. James sat on the plaintiff's side, his attorney beside him, a small stack of folders neatly arranged on the table. Across the room, Evelyn sat next to her own lawyer, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, her eyes downcast, avoiding James's gaze entirely. At the center of the proceedings was Rick, flanked by two officers. Shackled and stoic, his expression betrayed no remorse. His polished arrogance had been replaced with a cold indifference that made James's stomach churn. This man had nearly ruined his life, yet here he sat, as if he were merely a spectator in someone else's drama. The judge entered, and the room rose, a collective tension settling over everyone present. The sound of the gavel echoed sharply. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced. The prosecutor wasted no time laying out Rick's history, his numerous aliases, his carefully crafted scams, and the financial devastation he had left in his wake. Victims from across the state had come forward, each telling a chillingly similar story. Promises of a new life, the draining of family resources, and then his inevitable disappearance. But what made this case different, the prosecutor argued, was the level of premeditation involved. Rick had not only targeted Evelyn, but had manipulated her into becoming an accomplice in his schemes. He had orchestrated the theft of thousands of dollars from James, all while ensuring that Evelyn bore the brunt of the legal consequences if they were caught. James listened intently, his jaw tight. He'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, but hearing it all laid out so plainly still felt like a punch to the gut. He glanced briefly at Evelyn. She sat rigid, her face a mask of barely concealed shame. The judge turned his attention to James, gesturing for him to stand. "Mr. Davis, you've submitted a victim impact statement. Would you like to address the court?" James rose slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He scanned the room briefly, his eyes landing on Evelyn for just a second before he focused on the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "This man, Rick Grayson, didn't just steal from me. He shattered my family. He preyed on my wife's weaknesses, manipulated her, and left my daughter and me to pick up the pieces. What he took from us wasn't just money, it was trust, security, and years of hard work." James paused, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. "But Rick didn't do this alone. Evelyn, my wife, made her choices too. And while I believe she was manipulated, I also believe she knew what she was doing. She knew the risks, but she took them anyway. And the consequences of those choices, well, they're sitting here today." He swallowed hard, his voice tightening. "I'm not here to ask for revenge. I'm here to ask for justice, for my daughter, for myself, and for every other family this man has destroyed. I hope the court will remember that when it makes its decision." As James sat down, he exhaled slowly, his hands trembling slightly. The room was silent for a moment before the prosecutor called a surprise witness, a woman named Caroline. She was one of Rick's earlier victims, a mother of 3 whose life had been upended by his schemes. Her testimony painted an even darker picture of Rick's tactics, solidifying the court's understanding of his pattern of abuse and manipulation. When the judge finally delivered the sentence, the words felt like a release. Rick was sentenced to 10 years in prison for fraud, theft, and conspiracy. Evelyn, though spared jail time, was sentenced to community service and ordered to repay the stolen funds through restitution. The judge's parting words to her were sharp. "Your actions not only betrayed your family but made you complicit in harming others. It's a burden you will carry for a long time." Outside the courthouse, James stood in the cold autumn air, watching as Rick was led away in cuffs. Evelyn lingered near the steps, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes fixed on the ground. For a moment, James considered saying something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he turned and walked away, the sound of his boots on the pavement the only thing breaking the silence. Back home, James found Lily waiting for him on the couch, a book in her lap. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with a smile. He sat beside her, pulling her into a tight hug. "Is everything okay now, Daddy?" she asked softly. James pressed his lips to the top of her head, his heart full of emotions he couldn't yet name. "Not everything," he admitted, "but it's getting better." As they sat together, the weight on James's chest began to lift. Justice had been served. The past was behind them, and for the first time in months the future didn't feel so uncertain. The house was quieter than it had been in months, but this time it didn't feel empty. James stood in the living room, a box of Lily's art supplies in his hands. The furniture was arranged differently now, small changes that made the space feel fresh. He set the box down and stepped back, glancing around. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a home, one they were building together. "Dad!" Lily's voice called from the kitchen, breaking his thoughts. "I need your help!" James walked into the kitchen to find her standing on a chair, wrestling with a jar of peanut butter. She looked up at him with an exaggerated pout, holding the jar out as if it were the heaviest thing in the world. "Need a superhero?" he teased, ruffling her hair. He took the jar, twisting the lid off with ease and handing it back to her. Lily grinned triumphantly as if his success were hers. "Thanks," she said, hopping down from the chair. She spread the peanut butter on a slice of bread, humming a tune that James didn't recognize. Her ease, her laughter. It was a sight he hadn't seen in far too long. It reminded him that they were healing, little by little. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Lily turned to him. "Dad, are we okay now?" James looked at her, his chest tightening at the sincerity in her question. He nodded slowly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We're more than okay, kiddo. We're starting fresh, just you and me. And we're going to be stronger than ever." Lily smiled, leaning her head against his arm. "I like that," she whispered. The next day, James stood in the driveway, watching as a moving truck pulled away. Evelyn had come by earlier to pick up the last of her things. The visit had been brief, her demeanor quiet and somber. She hadn't asked to see Lily, and James hadn't offered. It was better this way, cleaner. As the truck disappeared down the road, James felt an unexpected lightness settle over him. The chapter of Evelyn in their lives was closed, and now it was time to focus on the pages ahead. That weekend, James and Lily tackled a project together. They painted the spare bedroom, turning it into a space where Lily could do her homework, draw, or simply daydream. She insisted on picking the color, a bright, cheerful yellow that made the room glow in the afternoon sun. They laughed as they accidentally got paint on each other, and for a moment, James felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, pure, unfiltered joy. It wasn't just the act of painting or the way Lily's laughter filled the room. It was the realization that they were rebuilding something stronger than what had been lost. "Dad, do you think we'll ever see Mom again?" Lily asked suddenly, her brush pausing mid-stroke. James took a deep breath, his hand tightening on the roller he was holding. "Maybe," he said honestly. "But right now, we're focusing on us, okay? And that's enough." Lily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I think I'm okay with that." That evening, James found himself alone on the porch, the cool night air brushing against his skin. He thought about everything that had led to this moment, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the long nights filled with questions he couldn't answer. But as he looked out at the quiet street, he felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. He pulled out his phone and opened a message draft he'd started weeks ago. It was addressed to Evelyn, but he hesitated for a moment before hitting delete. There was nothing left to say. She had her path now, and he had his. There was no point in trying to bridge the divide anymore. Instead, James walked back inside, where Lily was curled up on the couch with a blanket and a book. He sat down beside her, and she scooted closer, resting her head on his shoulder. Together, they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past lifting as they embraced the simple, steady rhythm of their new life. "Dad?" Lily said softly, breaking the silence. "Yeah? I think we're going to be happy again." James smiled, his heart full. I think you're right, kiddo. I think you're absolutely right. What do you think of Evelyn's actions? Share your thoughts in the comments. From 0 to 10, what's your score for this story? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And make sure to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen.